Hello, everyone. I'm Heather Lauer, CEO of People United for Privacy Foundation. We are an educational and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. Our vision is an America where all people can freely and privately support ideas and nonprofits they believe in so that all sides of a debate can be heard, individuals do not face retribution for supporting important causes, and all organizations have the ability to advance their missions because the privacy of their donors is protected. Thank you for attending our inaugural Lunch and Learn event. We look forward to hosting information-packed briefings that allow you to get up to speed on the latest developments in the world of donor privacy. I'll now turn this webinar over to our team of policy experts who will have a conversation over the next 45 minutes to share current threats and opportunities in state legislatures across the country. I hope you enjoy this Lunch and Learn discussion, and we look forward to your feedback. Brian, over to you.
Thank you, Heather. Hello, I am Brian Hawkins, Senior Director of External Affairs at People United for Privacy, and I will be your host this afternoon. As promised, this will be a 45-minute discussion on threats to nonprofit donor privacy rights and opportunities to strengthen those protections in states around the country. The content of this webinar is based on a forthcoming comprehensive memo that will be published on Monday, February 12th. So consider this a sneak preview. Our speakers today are Matt Nese, Vice President at People United for Privacy. Many of you already know Matt, so he needs little introduction. Matt has been with PUFP since January 2022. Prior to that, he spent a decade at the Institute for Free Speech. He is a nationally renowned expert on nonprofit donor privacy issues, and he will share his wisdom with us today. Joining Matt is Alex Baiocco, our Director of Government Affairs. Alex also comes from the Institute for Free Speech, where he spent 7 years working to defend political speech and associational privacy rights. In his role with PUFP, Alex manages our state government affairs portfolio, and I can assure you everyone will benefit from his insights today. Before we dig into this topic, let's quickly remember why these rights are so important. Nonprofit donor privacy is, at its core, a free speech right. Since the country's founding, Americans have enjoyed a fundamental right to contribute to causes they believe in without fear of having their names and home addresses exposed in a public database that could subject them to harassment and intimidation from government officials, extremists, or those who disagree with their views. This right has been an essential component of the First Amendment and societal progress throughout our history. From the abolitionist movement and the civil rights movement and onward to today, progress would not be possible without the ability of generous and civic-minded Americans to privately join and support the causes of their choice. Despite continuous challenges, the right to privately support nonprofits has been reaffirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court on numerous occasions, most notably in NAACP v. Alabama, and most recently in 2021 in Americans for Prosperity Foundation v. Bonta. While these landmark cases speak clearly about the importance of preserving privacy and association, the enemies of free speech are well organized and continue their march to undo these protections in increasingly aggressive and inventive ways. Today, we will provide you an overview of trends that we're seeing around the country, discuss several notable legislative threats, help you proactively identify legislation that would erode personal privacy protections, and share what you can do to protect personal privacy in your state. If you have any questions during this session, I encourage you to reach out directly to Matt or Alex after the webinar concludes. You can reach Matt at unitedforprivacy.com and Alex at unitedforprivacy.com. So with that, let's dive into the discussion. Matt, can you walk us through the memo you and Alex put together and what conclusions you reached?
Thanks, Brian. I'd be happy to. But first, I want to start by thanking everyone for taking time out of your busy day to join us. Your interest in this foundational issue is what makes it possible to defeat threats to citizen privacy, like those we document in our memo. Without strong protections for the privacy rights of nonprofit members and supporters, few causes would exist, let alone prosper, and important voices would disappear from the public debate. It's not an exaggeration to say that donor privacy rights are an essential building block for all causes. As Brian mentioned, the memo will be publicly released this coming Monday, but I'm happy to share some key takeaways this afternoon. People United for Privacy expects lawmakers in as many as 31 states to consider legislation in 2024 that would show nonprofit advocacy and expose members and supporters of nonprofit groups to threats, harassment, and intimidation. Many of the bills we cover are carryover bills. In carryover states, legislative rules permit bills to move from the first year of a two-year legislative session to the second year. Other bills are anticipated reintroductions of bills that were proposed but ultimately failed in 2023. I've worked on this issue for nearly 15 years, and history has proven time and again that privacy opponents will continue to reintroduce and refine their proposals until passage is secured. Just because a bill stalled or was rejected in a prior session doesn't mean it won't return or gain majority support in the future. Still, other efforts are one-off issues stemming from interim committee deliberations, task forces, and as responses to proposed ballot initiatives. And of course, some bills are new in 2024. Of the 31 states featured in this memo, 14 have legislatures controlled by Democrats, 12 have Republican-controlled legislatures, and 5 feature split control, whether between chambers or dividing the legislature and the governor. The lesson: party control has no bearing on whether an anti-speech or anti-privacy proposal will receive consideration or become law. There is some reason for optimism, but I want to be careful not to oversell it. Historically, legislative sessions in election years witness a lower volume of activity than their odd year post-election counterparts. Some of this is structural. 4 states, Montana, Nevada, North Dakota, and Texas, don't meet in regular session in even-numbered years. Other states have shorter sessions or focus primarily or exclusively on budget matters. From a policy standpoint, because of the complexity of their schemes, many privacy opponents struggle to secure an effective date for their proposal that would show the desired advocacy in enough time to have an impact in an election year. So they punt their efforts to the session immediately following an election year. That's the good news. The bad news is that while we are likely to see a lesser number of active legislative threats in 2024, those threats that are seriously considered are much likelier to be intense, as lawmakers pushing such efforts are buoyed by a desire to negatively impact nonprofit advocacy and the remainder of an election year or before their terms expire. It's very unlikely that most of the legislation discussed today and in this memo will emerge as a serious threat or become law. However, as both parties increasingly view nonprofit donor disclosure mandates as a tool for ruining their ideological opposition or settling political scores, the threat of anti-privacy proposals passing in states across the country is high. All nonprofits, regardless of their mission, must be on guard for harmful proposals in their state. This year, our concerns are particularly pronounced in California, Hawaii, Idaho, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Oklahoma, Oregon, Virginia, and Wyoming. We will discuss many of these states during today's webinar, and others will be covered in detail in PUFP's forthcoming memo.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. As a Californian, I must note it's always California. Alex, so Matt gave a pretty good overview of a lot of different things that's happening. What are some red flags the nonprofit community should be on the lookout for in legislation that can negatively implicate free speech and personal privacy?
Sure. Thanks, Brian. So most often threats to donor privacy and nonprofit advocacy show up in legislation changing a state's campaign finance laws. This occurs when laws originally intended to regulate, as you might expect, the financing of campaigns are reconfigured to broadly regulate any entity that engages in advocacy related to government or policy issues. In other words, donor disclosure requirements for candidates' campaign committees and political action committees, or PACs, are improperly applied to nonprofits speaking out about issues central to their missions. The most obvious red flag is any provision explicitly aimed at 501c organizations. However, provisions aimed at exposing nonprofit supporters are not always so easy to uncover. One method of carrying out this anti-privacy agenda through legislation is to simply broaden the definitions of regulated entities. For instance, a bill may amend the definition of political committee, which typically includes PACs and candidates' campaign committees, to include any entity that spends money on communications that could be interpreted as promoting or attacking a candidate or ballot measure, even if the communication doesn't actually urge voters to vote for or against the candidate or ballot measure. Privacy advocates should keep an eye out for definitions that reach beyond entities whose major purpose is engaging in election campaigns. Relatedly, a low spending threshold for triggering political committee reporting requirements puts nonprofit speech and privacy rights at risk. Alternatively, or additionally, a bill may make similar changes to descriptions of regulated communications, commonly found in definitions of terms such as expenditure, independent expenditure, and electioneering communication. Definitions that include phrases like refers to or mentions a candidate or ballot measure apply to many nonprofits that issue advocacy. Red flag language also includes vague descriptions such as promote, attack, support, or oppose, which is sometimes paired with a clarification that communications meet this definition regardless of whether they constitute express advocacy or urge voters to vote for or against a candidate. A definition that relies on the interpretation of a reasonable person or leaves it to regulators to decide if communications are an attempt to influence an election leaves nonprofits unable to determine which communications will trigger disclosure requirements. Lowered spending thresholds or expanded reporting windows are specifically intended to capture more speech, and when paired with disclosure requirements, may make common nonprofit communications impossible to carry out without exposing supporters' personal information. Lawmakers seeking to expose nonprofit donors may also introduce bills changing the reporting, disclosure, and/or disclaimer requirements for regulated entities and communications without altering existing definitions of such entities and communications. Of particular concern are changes to disclosure requirements for electioneering communications, which typically refer to communications that merely mention a candidate within a specified window of time prior to an election. Since sitting lawmakers are often also candidates, lots of policy-focused advocacy about current legislation ends up triggering reporting requirements for electioneering communications. Privacy advocates should look out for changes to such reporting requirements that mandate an itemized list of contributions with contributors' names and addresses. To the extent disclosure is required of groups that engage in limited election-related independent expenditures or express advocacy, the law should only require the disclosure of donors who earmarked contributions for specific election-related communications. Provisions that require nonprofits to disclose the names and addresses of all supporters who contributed a certain amount or gave within a certain time frame end up listing individuals as supporters of communications they may not support or even be aware of.
Wow, Alex, that's a lot to digest. Can you discuss what are some of the overarching trends you're seeing in the states?
Sure. So I mentioned red flag provisions that mandate disclosure of donors in connection with communications those donors may not support or have any knowledge of. This is sometimes called junk disclosure because it does not convey accurate information about the actual supporters of a message. While the vast majority of legislative threats to nonprofit speech and privacy would result in junk disclosure, two trending policies in states epitomize junk disclosure requirements: original source donor disclosure and top funder disclaimers. Original source donor disclosure requires groups to not only disclose their own contributors, but also their contributors. Under this policy, nonprofits that have always protected the privacy of their supporters are forced to disclose the names and addresses of their donors to a group they've contributed to in order for the recipient group to include that information in its own reports. In addition to the multi-layered privacy concerns, the record-keeping requirements and administrative burdens are enough to keep many nonprofits from participating in policy discussions. Top funder disclaimer requirements force groups to list their top contributors within the communication itself. This is the most public and direct means of tying individual supporters to specific communications they may not even support. Even worse, some top funder disclaimer requirements also require original source disclosure. As a result, a nonprofit supporter could find herself being named in an ad by a group she has never supported. Another concerning trend is legislation ostensibly aimed at eliminating foreign influence in elections, but that has the primary effect of violating American speech and privacy rights. Bills banning contributions and expenditures by so-called foreign influence corporations are a clear attempt to circumvent First Amendment protections recognized by the Supreme Court and Citizens United. These bills typically define foreign influence corporation as any company with as little as 1% of its equity owned by a foreign interest. In practice, this would strip First Amendment rights from many American businesses controlled and operated by American citizens, whose political engagement is in no way directed by foreign nationals. Such legislation could also impact the speech and privacy rights of nonprofits, particularly business associations that receive contributions from corporations owned by a multitude of shareholders. A somewhat nebulous threat emerging from vague concerns over foreign influence is more directly aimed at nonprofit supporters. Governors, attorneys general, and legislators in multiple states have announced plans to address concerns over alleged foreign contributions to nonprofits that are active in their states. This emerging threat, which is also unfolding in Congress, is also being tied to presently prominent concerns over election integrity. While there seems to be little consensus on legislation, the rhetoric alone is enough to put the nonprofit community on high alert. The limited proposals that have materialized would, at the very least, be speech-chilling administrative nightmares for nonprofits of all types. But the partisan-fueled and oftentimes conspiratorial rhetoric about foreign billionaires controlling election outcomes through so-called dark money groups portends a threat unlikely to fade without contentious battles in the states and in Congress for the future of nonprofit speech and privacy rights. Finally, several state legislatures are poised to pursue broad rewrites of their campaign finance code, in some instances due to prodding from the Secretary of State or governor. In some states, there's clearly interest in expanding nonprofit donor disclosure requirements. But even where discussions have not indicated a clear threat to nonprofits and their supporters, any legislative interest in broadly reexamining campaign finance laws always presents some risk to speech and privacy rights.
Wow, thank you, Alex. Matt, considering those trends that Alex just discussed, is there one particular trend or development that you found most notable?
Indeed, it's hard to pick, but as Alex just explained, while there's many trends worth discussing, one development in particular stands out. The scourge of Arizona Proposition 211 and its worrying spread to other states. First, some background so everyone knows what we're talking about. Arizona voters approved Proposition 211, dubbed by its backers as the Voters' Right to Know Act, in November 2022, a misleading campaign in which proponents and their allies in the media argued the initiative would force the disclosure of campaign donors, concealed the true impact of this draconian measure. The forced disclosure of donors and their donors, what the initiative terms original monies, to nonprofit organizations that voice opinions on public policy debates and legislative matters in Arizona. The end result will be many nonprofits choosing to self-censor and many Arizonans ceasing to give to causes they believe in, further entrenching the power of the media and elected officials while silencing the voices of everyday Arizonans. The initiative grants immense power to the Citizens Clean Elections Commission to enforce the law and decree the process by which a nonprofit reports the original monies accounting for its financial support. While 3 separate legal challenges to Prop 211 law are ongoing, more on that in a moment, the commission is actively promulgating rules and the text of the law is spreading to states around the country. In December 2022, the Goldwater Institute filed a lawsuit on behalf of 2 Arizona-based nonprofits, alleging that the law violates the state constitution's right to private affairs, among other deficiencies, by forcing disclosure of those individuals who support nonprofits that speak on public policy matters. Though the lawsuit was initially rejected by a state superior court, Goldwater filed an amended complaint in July of last year containing affidavits about the threat faced by donors to the plaintiffs. Americans for Prosperity filed a separate lawsuit in federal court last spring, AFP alleges that Proposition 211 violates the First Amendment by chilling the speech of donors to nonprofit organizations. Their lawsuit relies partially on the precedent established in Americans Prosperity Foundation v. Bonta, which Brian mentioned earlier. That court case repudiated California's mass collection of nonprofit donor information and reaffirmed robust and long-held privacy protections for nonprofit members and supporters. Most recently, Republicans in the Arizona legislature challenged the law last August, alleging that it violates the state constitution's separation of powers clause. The lawmakers assert that the law's vesting of legislative, judicial, and executive powers into one independent agency, the Citizens Clean Elections Commission, usurps legislative powers properly assigned to the legislative branch. Despite the multitude of ongoing litigation, the commission is undeterred and actively pursuing rulemakings to move enforcement of this draconian statute along. It's creating a mess for the nonprofit community in Arizona, as many organizations are paralyzed and afraid to voice an opinion on policy issues without running afoul of the law or violating the privacy of their supporters or their supporters' supporters. And just last week, we received disturbing news that Oklahoma Republican Representative Cody Maynard filed a rulemaking petition with the state's Ethics Commission, ostensibly to crack down on speech the representative dislikes. His petition copies word for word the chilling Arizona Prop 211 statute, and the Ethics Commission is scheduled to discuss the rulemaking petition at their regular meeting this Friday, February 9th. Fortunately, lawmakers in Oklahoma will have the opportunity to vote to approve or reject any proposed rules promulgated by the Ethics Commission later this spring, but this development is an extremely serious threat to all nonprofits active in Oklahoma and the privacy of Oklahomans who support them. There's also evidence the Prop 211 has spread to both Maine and Oregon, but we'll have more time to discuss those developments as the webinar continues.
Wow, that's very disturbing. Thank you, Matt. Shift over to Alex. Alex, you mentioned top funder disclaimers in a prior answer. Can you elaborate on that threat?
Sure, Brian. So what we're talking about here is spoken or written statement listing the top 3 to 5 contributors to an organization that must be included within or on the face of communications. Alarmingly, in many proposals, this requirement would apply to a wide range of communications about policy and legislative matters, not just ads expressly advocating the election or defeat of candidates. These proposals generally also cover not just traditional ads broadcast on TV and radio, but also online ads, organizations' own websites, and any printed materials. As I mentioned previously, these disclaimers are a particularly odious violation of personal privacy due to their extreme public nature and conveyance of misleading information. Requiring that a disclaimer list an organization's top donors wrongly conflates general support for a group with support for a particular ad's message. These requirements actively mislead the public by associating individuals with specific communications they may have no knowledge of and with which they may disagree. The many problems with such disclaimers are only made worse when the requirement stipulates that sources of original funds must be listed within communications. Unfortunately, some states, such as Arizona and California, have already enacted top funder disclaimer mandates, and it is an active threat in several other states in 2024, including Hawaii, Maine, Massachusetts, Oregon, and Virginia. As evidence that this threat is unlikely to dissipate, top funder disclaimers have also become popular at the federal level, with prominent federal legislation such as H.R. 1 including such proposals.
Thank you, Alex. Matt, is there any legislation that should most concern privacy advocates?
Absolutely. And there's more than I could reasonably cover here, but I wanted to talk about 3 states in particular worth further discussion because the threat itself, the response to it, and what may happen next. First state we should discuss is Michigan. Following recent charges of misappropriating nonprofit funds involving aides to the former Michigan Speaker of the House, Attorney General Dana Nessel and Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson are urging Michigan lawmakers to pass legislation increasing regulation and oversight of nonprofits active in Michigan. In a press release announcing the charges, Attorney General Nessel warned lawmakers using unwieldy rhetoric that, and I quote, "The facts of this case serve to reinforce how the current laws regulating nonprofit political action committees are woefully inadequate to ensure the integrity of Michigan's political operations. It is incumbent upon the legislature to act swiftly in enacting significant changes to create transparency and reduce the pervasive malfeasance which erodes public trust and accountability in our state government, unquote. You'll have to forgive some of the rhetoric in the quote. There's no such thing as a nonprofit political action committee, for instance, but I digress. As is a shameful tradition in this area, lawmakers and anti-privacy activists seize on charges of wrongdoing and corruption to justify their schemes and score points against their opponents. It is especially bold given that the accusations against the former Michigan Speaker's aides are tied to already illegal activity, which begs the question why we're seeking to pass additional regulations when laws clearly exist to uncover and punish such wrongdoing. Attorney General Nese has also reportedly urged lawmakers, quote, not to let perfect be the enemy of the good in their efforts to adopt legislation. Better to seize on the environment and worry about the consequences later, I guess. And Secretary Benson has called for expanding donor disclosure requirements for all nonprofits, not just those with connections to elected officials, the subject broadly at issue in Michigan. It's our understanding that the legislation will likely be introduced in the first quarter of this year, and we'll be shocked if it doesn't pose a significant threat to nonprofit advocacy and citizen privacy. Worse, Michigan lawmakers will be in session for the duration of 2024, so the threat is likely to persist throughout the year. Next, let's talk about Maine. LD 1590 is a carryover bill introduced in 2023 by Republican Senator Richard Bennett. The measure would introduce a dizzying array of disclosure and record-keeping requirements that would force groups to not only publicly identify their own contributors, but also their contributors' contributors. As Alex discussed earlier, this is what's known by privacy opponents as original or true source disclosure. Never mind that many nonprofits won't have access to a list of their supporters, making compliance both impossible and misleading. For anti-privacy activists, self-censorship that would inevitably occur is the intent. Furthermore, the recipient would be required to include a disclaimer identifying the top 3 sources of original funds within communications about candidates and ballot measures. In other words, the bill would force groups to very publicly expose the names and addresses of donors who are not even the group's donors, but rather supporters of groups that have made contributions. This impossibly convoluted measure is backed by anti-privacy activists at the Campaign Legal Center and Represent Us, and modeled partially after Arizona Prop 211, the aggressive anti-privacy measure I discussed earlier. After initially being recommended for passage as amended by a joint committee last year, Maine nonprofits, including Maine Conservation Voters and Planned Parenthood, voiced their serious concerns to lawmakers, and the bill was scheduled for reconsideration this year. As Planned Parenthood cautioned in their testimony, quote, the disclosures in LD 1590 subject nonprofit donors to a potential harassment and targeting. Those risks to privacy and safety have the very real consequence of chilling speech and possible violation of the First Amendment. In January 2024, the Joint Committee heeded the nonprofit community's concerns and voted 10-3 to issue an ought not to pass report. Because of Maine's rather unique legislative process, the committee's vote acts as a recommendation, and the full Senate will now have an opportunity to weigh in on the Joint Committee's recommendation to kill the bill. While the forecast looks bleak for this particular proposal, it's still very much alive until the Senate weighs in. Lastly, I'd like to discuss Virginia, which has experienced significant activity in this area over just the past few weeks. In 2023, various threats to free speech and privacy were defeated in the Republican-controlled House of Delegates, including a Republican-introduced ban on political speech by so-called foreign-influenced corporations. The most significant threat, however, came from legislation that would have forced nonprofits to publish the name of their top 3 donors on the face of messages that merely mention candidates, many of whom are elected officials, in the lead up to an election. This top lender disclaimer requirement for electioneering communications, a convoluted term for issue speech that Alex mentioned earlier, would have applied to nonprofits speaking to the public about elected official stances on policy issues. The measure passed the Democratic-controlled Senate on a party line vote last year before dying in a House subcommittee. With Democrats now in control of both chambers of the Virginia General Assembly, the threat of similar anti-privacy legislation becoming law is heightened. Already, Democratic lawmakers have introduced companion bills, HB 276 and SB 78, that would expand the existing electioneering communication definition and require top 3 funder disclaimers on messages about policy issues and ballot referenda by 501c3 charities and think tanks, 501c4 advocacy nonprofits, and 501c6 trade associations. Just this week, The Senate bill was reported favorably from committee and awaits a vote by the full Senate, while the House version was continued to 2025 on a voice vote in a House committee, meaning it will carry over to next year's session. This particular legislative threat may remain dormant until next year, but privacy advocates should keep a close eye on the Senate bill to see if the Senate follows the House's lead and be on the lookout for additional threats that could emerge later in the 2024 session.
Thank you, Matt. We'll switch back to Alex. Now, Alex, Prop 211 has come up multiple times throughout our discussion so far, and that was passed by a ballot initiatives. Do you anticipate any other ballot measures this year that's a concern the nonprofit community?
Yes, Brian. So in Oregon, activists are working to place a measure known as Initiative Petition 9, modeled after Arizona Prop 211 on the November 2024 ballot. Like Arizona Prop 211, Initiative Petition 9 would force nonprofits to disclose their donors and their donors' donors, called original funds in Initiative Petition 9, as a consequence of engaging in a wide range of speech related to policy debates and legislative matters. Initiative Petition 9 also includes a top funder disclaimer requirement for so-called political advertisements, the definition of which contains just about every red flag, making clear that the disclosure requirements are triggered not only by express advocacy, but also issue speech. Within these regulated communications, organizations must prominently display the names of the 4 contributors providing the largest amounts of, quote, original funds, along with, quote, the type of businesses from which the major source has obtained a majority of income over the previous 5 years, end quote. In order to avoid a repeat of the disastrous outcome in Arizona, privacy advocates should understand that this ballot measure impacts far more than campaign contributions and expenditures. Recognizing the threat to privacy of their members and their ability to engage in effective advocacy in Oregon, labor organizations are working to put a competing measure on the ballot that would include many of Petition 9's changes to campaign finance law, but avoid the worst provisions undermining speech and privacy rights. While it's possible that the Legislative Assembly may act to pass their own legislation in this year's short session, Governor Tina Kotek recently stated that she anticipates any changes to disclosure and reporting requirements will be enacted by voters at the ballot box.
Okay, so most of the content so far has been pretty dark and depressing. So let's shift in a more optimistic direction. Matt, can you share what is there any good news on the horizon for the nonprofit community?
Well, despite Alex and I spending the past 30 minutes discussing threats to nonprofit advocacy and citizen privacy rights in states around the country, very happy to report the overall trend for donor privacy rights is positive. Since 2018, both Republicans and Democrats have joined together to support proactive legislation championed by People United for Privacy and backed by many other nonprofits that prohibits government agencies and officials from demanding or releasing the private personal information of donors, members, and volunteers of nonprofit organizations, except where required by existing law. This policy, known as the Personal Privacy Protection Act, sets a common sense floor for basic respect of nonprofit supporters' privacy. Also serves very importantly as a crash course for lawmakers who may not be aware of the importance of donor privacy or the gravity of threats to this right. Despite more than 6 decades of rulings from the Supreme Court upholding the privacy rights of donors to nonprofit causes, as we discussed today, efforts to violate these rights continue unabated in states around the country, as well as in Congress and at regulatory agencies. The lesson is clear. Precedent alone is not enough to safeguard Americans' personal privacy. Proactive reforms are needed. Since 2018, 17 states have adopted this privacy protection policy, including 3 additional states last year: Alabama, Indiana, and Kentucky. To date, 73 million Americans have their privacy rights protected because of these vital reforms. Support for these privacy protections is routinely bipartisan. State privacy legislation, or the Personal Privacy Protection Act legislation, has been signed into law by both Republican and Democratic governors, and has been sponsored by both Republican and Democratic lawmakers. Measures have passed unanimously in both Democratic-controlled legislative chambers like Virginia and Republican-controlled bodies like Indiana, and by voice vote as in New Hampshire. These protections have been supported by groups as diverse as state Right to Life organizations and Planned Parenthood chapters, chambers of commerce and labor unions, and organizations on both sides of debates about civil liberties. If there's one issue everyone can agree on in our divided age, it's the importance of protecting the privacy of Americans who support nonprofit causes. I want to specifically mention Alabama's law, which passed the legislature unanimously in 2023 and was sponsored by Democratic State Senator Roger Smitherman and signed into law by Republican Governor Kay Ivey. That effort was championed equally by socially conservative organizations and the ACLU, among others. This victory was historically significant as well, occurring just 65 years after the state's infamous actions that led to NAACP versus Alabama. The 1958 Supreme Court case, Brian, you mentioned earlier, that recognized the First Amendment right to privately join and support nonprofit causes. Senator Smitherman, the bill's sponsor, explained, quote, "People have a right to give to the causes they support without having their information taken and abused." We agree. And the best news, we anticipate as many as 5 states advancing similar reforms in 2024. People United for Privacy will be documenting and supporting these efforts, and will share more information, including how your organizations can help, as the next few months unfold. This isn't the only exciting development, though. After West Virginia lawmakers adopted privacy reforms in 2020, they conducted a review of existing campaign finance and lobbying laws in 2023 and quickly discovered a multitude of provisions threatening the privacy of nonprofits and their supporters who speak about policy issues. Many of these provisions were outdated and likely unconstitutional following recent Supreme Court precedent. Happy to report that lawmakers passed 2 bills last year to clean up the state's laws and bring them in line with the First Amendment. West Virginia's achievement in tackling privacy reforms in a comprehensive manner offers a model for other states. The memo, which everyone will receive on Monday, discusses this opportunity in more detail, but Kansas is another state to watch in 2024. While legislative interest in broadly re-examining campaign finance laws always presents some risk to speech and privacy rights, the attention on such laws in the Kansas legislature is a promising opportunity for positive change. The ongoing reform effort is in part motivated and informed by the distressing experience of a small organization formed by neighbors to speak out about local issues that face shocking demands from the Kansas Governmental Ethics Commission to register as a PAC, file complex reports, and disclose its donors. The commission employed a vague and open-ended rule for determining PAC status that provides no clear guidance to the public or consistent standards for enforcement. During the 2023 session, the legislature formed a special committee to investigate issues in the state's campaign finance laws that were left unaddressed by a process-oriented reform bill adopted in the spring. These outstanding issues include Kansas law's constitutionally suspect definition of political committee and donor disclosure requirements for nonprofit groups that are not considered political committees under the law, but may occasionally comment on a political issue. Both of these defects affect the personal privacy rights of Kansans and the nonprofits they support. We're optimistic the legislature will act on the special committee's recommendations in 2024 and pass meaningful improvements to existing law to protect and strengthen nonprofit advocacy and personal privacy. So no, the news is not all bad.
Thank you, Matt. That's really exciting work. And I know we've been working with the coalition of partners here in all these states. So that helps transition to the final question for Alex. So Alex, we have all these threats, we have all these opportunities. To our audience here today, what can they do to help fight these threats in their particular state?
Sure. So first and foremost, I'd say don't assume that legislation won't impact your organization simply because you're a nonpartisan nonprofit that doesn't engage in electoral advocacy. We've seen firsthand that many nonprofits don't fully realize the impact of measures promoted by advocates as, quote, campaign finance transparency efforts until it is too late. Similarly, lawmakers, in some instances, even those that initially support a particular bill, sometimes aren't aware of a bill's harms to nonprofit advocacy until nonprofits in the state communicate their concerns to legislators. As an initial line of defense, it's worth reminding lawmakers of the strong First Amendment protections for associational privacy rights and recent decisions affirming those protections. Following the previously mentioned U.S. Supreme Court decision in AFPF v. Bonta, the U.S. 10th Circuit Court recently ruled that Wyoming's disclosure regime for electioneering communications, as applied to the nonprofit that filed the First Amendment challenge, is unconstitutional. Lawmakers should be aware that vague and overbroad disclosure requirements are likely to face constitutional challenges. Finally, if you come across legislation in your state that includes any of the previously mentioned red flags, don't hesitate to reach out to People United for Privacy. We will gladly assess the threat to privacy and speech rights and work to eliminate or mitigate the threat however we can. Again, you can reach Matt at unitedforprivacy.com, and you can reach me at alex@unitedforprivacy.com.
And that concludes our first quarterly Lunch and Learn webinar. Thank you for joining us today. One reminder, once again, to emphasize the point, the comprehensive memo will publish on Monday, February 12th. We will distribute that broadly. Check our website, reach out to myself, Matt, Alex, or whatever, but we will make sure you have that in your hands. We hope to see you again at our next webinar in the spring. If you have any comments or questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you for your partnership. We're excited to work with you to defend and advance nonprofit donor privacy rights in your state.